Hi, this is Ed Rushman for Whitestone Journal. Let's talk a little bit about prison reform on the way home. So, there's a number of reasons why societies put people in prison. And, maybe that's not something you've thought about much before, but let's think about that. So, if we're going to do that, let's think back to a time where maybe there weren't prisons and people just dealt with justice differently. Yes, it's sunset, so the sun's coming down, and it's really in my face right now. So I've got the thing protecting me here. Anyway, you can't see my face, haha. So, in one of the things, obviously, is revenge. Punishment and revenge. Society demands justice. Okay, so let's talk about that. Well, obviously, that doesn't sound very much like let him who is without, or her, who is without sin cast the first stone, and, vengeance is mine, says the Lord, I will repay, which implies that you better not take vengeance. And yet in the Old Testament, there is a certain amount of that allowed. It's provided for in the law of Moses. But, okay, so we're living in the gospel. Revenge. Revenge really has no part in a just society, because revenge actually doesn't do anything to fix what happened in the first place. It doesn't solve the problem. It just makes people feel better for reasons that really aren't very good. But it doesn't solve the problem. Okay, what's another reason? Another reason is the idea of justice, that, the person must pay the price for their crimes. But, we haven't done a very good job always of determining what that price ought to be. And we're going to come back to this one. If somebody goes to, let me touch on it a little bit now. If we send somebody to prison for robbery for 5 years, I don't know what the penalty is, but let's say 5 years, then when they get out, it's harder for them to get work. There's a stigma attached to them as an ex-con. So really, their sentence is 5 years plus possibly the rest of their life of being ostracized and certainly being looked down on by people, being more at risk for recidivism, which is coming back into the prison, more likely to commit another crime, because society isn't embracing them and trying to help them get into a productive form of life. So, when we talk about, well, they have to pay the price, that price is a lot bigger than what we necessarily think it is. And we all work together to make that price more than it should be. And what should it be? It should be what society sets it at. And when we go beyond that, we're actually going beyond the bounds of justice. Okay, so we've got revenge, we've got paying the price, a desire for justice, which is very, very hard for us to do. Boy, being just is awfully hard. And then the other thing is obviously, in some forms of it, maybe the person has to work off some of what they owe the person they committed the crime against. The person suffered loss. Maybe they have to go off and work to repay that person. But sometimes the damage is more than they can ever repay. And certainly being in a prison, we don't necessarily want to make them work farms. And even if we did, they're not going to get paid much, because prisoners aren't going to be doing, stuff that makes millions of dollars. And sometimes the cost of what they did was that high. All right, so then we get into some other things. Obviously, protecting society. I don't know that we always base prison sentences on that. But if somebody, let's take the extreme case, somebody's a murderer. Okay, then under revenge, an eye for an eye, then they lose their life. That's the basis for the death penalty, which the Catholic Church unequivocally, at least the bishops of the United States have said, is not something that's morally right. And there's a number of reasons for that we'll go to on another time. But within, so let's say they commit murder, and then you say, okay, well, they have to pay the price, which may not be their life, but we'll put them in prison for the rest of their life. It doesn't take into account maybe the circumstances of the murder or anything. Sometimes they do take that into account in sentencing. But the question there is, are they a threat to society? I remember a movie, The Greatest Show on Earth, with Charlton Heston, Jimmy Stewart. Jimmy Stewart, if I remember right, played a doctor, an older doctor, who had if I remember right, had killed his wife because she was suffering from a painful illness. It was mercy killing. We don't believe that that's right. But the question is, in a case like that, what should his prison sentence have been? Should he go to prison? He's got one wife. He's not likely to get married again in his advanced years. Is he really likely to kill anybody else? Well, he's a doctor. He's already demonstrated he believes in taking the life of someone that he cares about very much. Could he be in a position where he would feel bad for a patient and do the same thing? Well, that's something to consider. I'm not saying that he shouldn't go to prison. I'm not saying that he should. I'm just questioning. Thomas More's biography, not in the movies about him, but in the biography written by William Roper, there's a place in there where he talks about whether or not he should be executed for refusing to sign a document. And one of the things he brings into account is about the law is that it takes into account malice. If there's no malice, if there's no intent to harm, if there's no intent to do harm to someone, then there should be less or no penalty. Accidents happen where there's no malice, but we still put people in prison for it sometimes. Drunk driving accidents. Okay, let's not get into whether there's malice there, but it doesn't seem like there really is. So, going back to it, protecting society should be the thing that we really take as number one. And I don't know that there should be a number two. How can we justify seeking revenge? How can we justify imposing punishments on people when we've received mercy? And we have. We've all received mercy from God. We've received mercy from each other. And if each of us were to suffer all of the fully deserved consequences of our actions, we'd all be pretty darn sorry. It would not be a happy circumstance. So, let's look at it from the point of view of protecting society. If we look at it that way, then a couple of things happen. One is we try to make prison terms that are to get the person away from society long enough to protect them. Having a prison term that gets the person away from society for a time so they can reflect on their life may have value. That actually could have, and that's the other one. Some people think that prison is about rehabilitation. We don't work it that way. I mean, the fact is, in the United States, prison is anything but rehabilitation. Also, rehabilitation implies that the prison system knows how people ought to live and somehow teaches them that. And prison clearly does not do that. There is no way. It teaches them how to commit more crimes. It teaches them to be violent. It teaches them to be animals, how to get along with brutal guards and a system that is just corrupt and rotten, how to get drugs even when you're in prison. I mean, there's just a lot to it that's not good. So, really, we're not very good at rehabilitation, but there is some rehabilitative effect possibly in getting somebody away from temptation for a time. If someone is in prison because they were using drugs, and we won't get into that one about whether or not they should go to prison for drug use, but if they are, that should be a time where they're clean and they have a chance to get out of that cycle of drug use. It should not be a time where they're abused. Okay, so let's think about that. So much for rehabilitation. So then we have to really think, does getting this person into prison protect society? Are they a threat to society? And that should always be in there. So now we say it's all about protecting society. Does it protect society to have people brutalized in prison by other prisoners? And the answer is no. As a matter of fact, it makes it worse for society, because when the person comes out, they're going to be less mentally healthy, less socially integrated than they were when they went in. However bad they went in, they're coming out worse if they've been raped and beaten up by other prisoners. So that's not a good idea. So we need to get rid of that. So the sad thing is that people often say, well, you know what? They deserve it. If they're going to go out and do the things they've done, they deserve it. Some guy that's a child molester goes into prison and somebody stabs him to death. And they say, well, you know what? He got what he deserved. But that isn't what he was sentenced to. If that's what he deserved, then that should have been the sentence. But we're not here for that, and that doesn't protect society. There are other ways of protecting society without taking life. I hope that this is kind of making sense. So the other thing is then, what about the stuff they get out of prison? They can't get a job, society shuns them, and everything else. And some people say, well, they've paid their debt to society. Well, that's back to the retribution idea, that they're suffering the penalty. But if it's about protecting them from society, and we say we need to get this person that committed robbery into jail for 5 years, and in 5 years we think that they will have had time to think about it, they are protected from society's protected from them, and then we're going to give them another chance to behave. But we need to take them out of society long enough that we feel there's some protection there. At least they can't commit a robbery, but every 5 years that way. And the next time it's going to be a harsher sentence, because they've demonstrated they can't go 5 years isn't enough. So then we put them out for 10 years. And you know what? Eventually, if they commit enough robberies, maybe they do get a life sentence. Because at that point, they've demonstrated that society just isn't safe, as long as they're on the outside. Oh, it's a terrible thing. But that might be reasonable. That may be the way that it has to be. Some people won't like that. But it's all about, have they demonstrated that they're no longer a threat to society? Can they show that? All right. Anyway, that's a few thoughts. I think a lot of prison reform could certainly be done. And that the key would be to think about protecting society and eliminating all other reasons, except allowing that a person that goes to prison may, if they're given access to books and good things that they choose, their free will is still respected as much as possible. There may be some self-rehabilitation. And if we're looking at protecting society, we might even consider some alternatives to prison that would get them away from society, provide sufficient protection, without necessarily putting them into the prison system. Certainly, home arrest, restrictive collar things, they're computery things that make it so they can't go into places they shouldn't be. Relocation to a different community. Forced relocation might actually be a good alternative to prison if it's done right. With all the mobile phones and internet and email and everything else, you're not really getting away from old influences, but maybe we can do that. We should be thinking about these things. We could get a lot more creative than we are, but we've got to stop the brutality. We've got to stop abusing these people when they come out of prison and perpetuating that cycle so that they never ever really escape. We've got to take better care of our people. Certainly this would empty out the prisons a lot if we took this approach. It would change things. There'd be a lot of times we wouldn't put people in prison because society didn't need to be protected by that drastic of means. Anyway, that's a lot of thoughts. Let me know what you think in the comments. And this is Ed Rushman for Whitestone Journal. Thank you.